what can be achieved when we actually have an effective evaluation of development programs. This morning still, we are going to be hearing from people who have had their hands right in the middle of it. As Ruth talked about the history of the evaluation field over the last 10 years, what you would have learned 10 years ago. I think 10 years ago, or in the last 5 years ago, I would say, half time through the history of the evaluation. If you looked at Africa and said, what are the evaluations that's been implemented, and who were they targeted for, who was using that evidence, and for what, you realize that most of those evaluations responded more to donor needs. It was to report back to the main funders what they needed to see. Sometimes governments in the countries where these evaluations take place may not even be aware that the studies have taken place, or not even have the results to use them. And I think over the last 5 years, we've seen a significant shift in thinking, where governments are actually increasingly being the ones demand that they will actually use and have access to this. And we have, in the last year, an example of one African country, and I think maybe the only country, I don't know, in the world, where evaluation is actually a ministry of its own. So that's how far we've come. And this morning, I think we couldn't have assembled a much better panel than the people we have here. Andrew, to my immediate right, is Andrew Osei Asibey, who is currently the Chief Monitoring and Evaluation Technical Advisor in the Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation of the Government of Ghana. Andrew has extensive experience from the World Bank and different other places, but what is really critical about his work is understanding how you set up and implement government systems at both national and subnational level. And that's what he's been doing with his new position in Ghana. Next to Andrew is Esmie Kainja. Esmie is the Principal Secretary for Gender in the Ministry of Gender, Disability and Social Welfare in Malawi. And within this ministry, she's really been the one. She's been, I think one thing with our panel is that they have all practiced evaluation. They've managed evaluation programs, but now they are on the other side of what we usually will call users or policymakers that might use these results. And so Esmie has managed the social cash transfer of Malawi, and this is one of the key evaluation programs that we talk about within the continent, and I'm sure she would tell us a little bit more about it. And last but not the least is Timothy Lubanga. Timothy is an Assistant Commissioner for Monitoring and Evaluation at the Office of the Prime Minister of Uganda. And within the Office of the Prime Minister, OPM, as is generally known, Timothy has been in charge of coordinating a lot of the evaluation that has been going on. And you've heard earlier that Uganda is one of the countries with the largest numbers of evaluation programs and has really had the longest history in many ways of implementing evaluations of national programs. So one of the things we are seeing here is really about creating national evaluation systems and how you do that. How do you institutionalize evaluation and evidence use within governments? And that's really what we would be here. Now we would want to have an opportunity to also have the panel, the audience contribute to this conversation. So I will start with one question to each of the panelists. You respond to those. I will have some opening question, and then I will ask one general question that I want each of you to respond to, and hopefully that will get us going. But I'll start with Ghana. So Ghana is one country today that has a full ministry dedicated to monitoring and evaluation. How did Ghana get to that point of establishing an entire ministry for monitoring and evaluation? What difference is it making in terms of evidence generation and use?
Okay, thank you. But, before Ghana, South Africa had established Department of Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation. Well,
okay, yeah, well,
so,
could be.
yeah, but in terms of institutional arrangements for monitoring and evaluation, the ministry obviously came into existence in January 2017. But before that, we had the National Planning Commission that did some evaluation and evaluation capacity building. But their products, should I say, were mainly supply-driven. They prepared annual reports and submitted them to Parliament, but that was it. Nobody read them or used them. So with the change of government, the president decided to set up a Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation through an executive instrument, headed and nominated a very experienced member of government as the minister for monitoring and evaluation, and also made him a member of cabinet and a member of the economic management team. We didn't have the benefit of a national M&E policy. It's now being developed. So we started with what we call a government resource framework, 2017-2018, which is to cover the 4-year mandate of the current government. We ended up with about 90 priorities. So what we did was to categorize them, but when we did that, the president wasn't very happy. He thought that we were trying to divide his government. But over time, he's gradually warming up to the importance of selectivity, focusing on a few programs. So currently, we have about 8 programs that we are seriously tracking. We came out with our first annual report last year. Not much had been done, but we thought that we should develop an annual progress report, which is color-coded. And when our minister presented the first report, it generated a lot of discussion, and in fact, some ministers were actually upset. We are in the process of developing our second annual report, which is almost completed, and the minister hopes to table it in cabinet in the next 2 weeks. So this is how far we've come. We had to set up a network of what we call focal persons from within the ministries to assist us, because we really didn't have the capacity to track data. And one key element is that we are currently focusing mainly on monitoring, but we hope to do some serious systematic reviews and in-depth evaluations starting from next year.
Okay, so just following up on your conversation, and particularly within Ghana, we've had the Ghana Statistical Service as one of the primary agencies that generated official statistics in Ghana. How is the relationship between the ministry and the Ghana Statistical Service?
Well, if we look at the current setup, we work mainly with the sectors. And we assume that in tracking or collecting data, the sectors will be collaborating with the Ghana Statistical Service. That we have not had direct relationship with the Ghana Statistical Service.
What would you say, what has been important for Uganda in building this commitment at the national level and housing it within the office of the Prime Minister? And over the years that you have been within this, what's been the challenges? What are the opportunities you see, particularly in terms of your coordination role with all the other ministries?
Thank you. Yeah, so the story in the Uganda case has been long, and I think even from the morning session, Howard and Mani talked about Uganda having participated in several partnerships over the years in building its story. So I think that maybe for us it's a little different, but I think some of the most important factors that have led us to where we are was, I think, quite early enough, we had good champions. We had passionate people in leadership. We had a prime minister who was passionate about results, about whether government should be interested in knowing how its programs are being implemented and not. And so having a strong interest and leadership at the level of a minister or permanent secretary level has been a critical factor for us over the years. But more importantly, I think having a consistent team of technocrats to drive this agenda forward. At the end of the day, you need consistency, because public policy making is a competitive exercise. And in order to remain influential in that competitive environment, you need a consistent team of processes, systems, and staff, if you like, to drive the agenda. And I think we have been lucky to have this for 10, 15 years, a team of people who have driven the agenda. And finally, maybe having a policy. In the Uganda case, we started developing a national policy as way back as 2009, and by 2013, we had a national policy approved. Now, the policy supports us to make our case, helps us articulate what we want to do in terms of developing an evaluation culture in the country, the importance of having public policies and programs evaluated, the need to attach resource allocation to evidence and stuff like that. So these 3 points, I think, have been quite crucial in helping us develop our history.
Thank you. And just for your first input, Esmie, Malawi is a country that at this point you don't have a national system, ministry or agency for monitoring and evaluation, but you have the Ministry of Gender and coordinating this big program and effort in the country. Has there been an effort to actually institutionalize monitoring and evaluation at the national level, and what's been your experience trying to achieve that?
Yeah, thank you so much. Probably before I go to that question, to respond to the question, I wanted just to give a synopsis of the context of social protection. What it was is that the ministry, the social protection is housed in the ministry where money is, Ministry of Finance. That's a good starting point. And that, because I think the Minister of Finance is key in deciding. And then we have the M&E in the same ministry, while the Office of President and Cabinet looks at M&E for all ministry agencies. But in terms of social protection, what is key to note is that the implementation was like in silos. Social protection under my Ministry of Gender, Public Works, Ministry of Local Government, School Feeding, Ministry of Education, and Microfinance and Village Loans and Savings in another ministry responsible for community development. So we can say that with the impact evaluations, a lot of things have changed in terms of design. It has helped to to change the design of the program. But in terms of M&E, we still rely on the Ministry of Economic Planning and Development. These other ministries, sector ministries, they do also have their internal planning and M&E, which feed into the Ministry of Economic Planning and the Ministry of Finance.
Okay.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. So, for Malawi, can you tell us a little bit more? Within your ministry, you've managed this, how the particular evaluation that has done on cash transfers has generated initial results, and there are new questions now around whether the impact is being sustained longer term. What is the government doing? How is the government using this particular evaluation?
All right. Indeed, the impact evaluation has come up with so many positive impacts in the social cash transfer. The access to food consumption improved. I know that I'm doing another presentation in the afternoon to focus more on that, but there are positive health impacts, especially on the youth, and the asset accumulation, and the health impacts, many more. But I want to focus on how the country has used the information to shape the direction. One, there have been more partners now getting interested because of these positive outcomes to support the social cash transfer program. And this has also led to the change in the design of the program. Initially, it used to focus on consumption, but now there's a change to look at the deep root causes of the poverty. And we also worked in silos, as I have stated before, that it was all fragmented, but now it has helped us to come up with a program which is looking at the cycle approach and looking also at shock sensitive. So the design of the social program has completely changed. And the issue I was talking about, the social protection in the Ministry of Finance, that has also generated a lot of interest by the Minister of Finance to increase funding in the social cash transfer by more than 30%, which is really, really appreciated. And then it has also changed the processes in the design, like looking at issues of referral and linkages, graduation. So to Malawi, I think, but this impact evaluation has really helped a lot. Even the political commitment to support the program has been there. The absorption by the community, because the design of the impact evaluation involved the communities, the chiefs. So even the interest by the community to monitor what is happening in the social protection has been superb. Yeah, thank you.
So this session is really about championing evaluation and evidence use. So maybe I'll come back to you. And when you think about evidence use, you've talked about the first report you generated and the type of interest it got within ministries and different ministries. Beyond sharing the results, how is the government of Ghana, and you're looking at your second report coming out, in terms of the use of this information, beyond knowing which ministries are doing well and not doing well, is it affecting budget allocations? Is it, what are the implications of the use, and how are you using this particular evidence you're generating in the country?
Yeah, maybe I will respond by way of an example. Okay. When we did our first progress report, we realized that one of the milestones that the Ministry of Interior had identified was getting hydraulic fire tenders. Accra is beginning to have, tall buildings. In the past, we didn't. And we discovered to our horror that the whole of Accra, there were no hydraulic fire tenders. And so we made a point, and our minister presented that in cabinet, and in last year's budget, they made provision to procure 2 hydraulic tenders. So these are some of we call our work real-time monitoring. As I said earlier, we are yet to get into in-depth evaluations or systematic reviews. We've just begun one with a partner looking at the government introduced free senior high school education, and that has created a lot of challenges. So we're working with ID Insight to do some sort of rapid assessment to look at some of the challenges or constraints. So we feel that even with the monitoring information, we are able to have some impact. And it's because of our minister, who in an earlier government was actually an acting finance minister. And he's a member of the economic management team, which is chaired by the vice president. The economic management team is a clearinghouse of policies. And so he's able to influence things. So if whatever we do, he's able to take it to cabinet. And of course, it has not always been easy because some of the ministers come back fighting, especially if they get so many ambers or red in the rating.
Thank you. And Tim, can you maybe share with us one example of the, let me use the word, the biggest maybe political fallout from your evaluations that you've done in Uganda? What has been the one consequence of that in terms of a government policy that shifted or as a result of your evaluation results?
Well, thank you. In the first part of the question, you said political fallout. I think the best case is what was in the video, because that is the most recent program evaluation that has caused, if you like, a political effect in the country. But it has already been shown in the video, so maybe I don't need to explain. But maybe just to share that we have, I think now, a number of public policies and public programs whose evaluations are beginning to cause real reforms in the public sector. And that's a good thing for us. I think Howard pointed out that evidence shows we have so many evaluations that have been done in the country. And the challenge has been, why are these evaluations not being used? Are the people responsible aware of them? Was there appetite for these evaluations? Why did we put so much resources in doing them and not put them to use? But I think over the years, we now have a much bigger cadre of policymakers who appreciate the value of evidence and are using them. So in the case that was showed in the video, there was an outcry. In the last 10 or 15 years, there was a lot of new agencies, government agencies that were created. So every ministry would come up with an authority or an agency. For example, the Ministry for Environment and Water would develop a National Environment Management Authority, a National Forest Authority, a National Wetlands Authority, and so on. So there was a proliferation of so many authorities within every ministry. And when they had grown to some unbelievable numbers, there was an outcry that maybe there is a lot of duplication, maybe there's a lot of wastage. Are all these agencies and government authorities really effective? Are they of value? Or are we having duplication and resource wastage here? So Cabinet then decided that, please, why don't you do an evaluation of these institutions so that we understand whether they are actually meeting the objectives for which they are set. So we commissioned an evaluation in partnership with 3IE of 119 public agencies. And just to assess in the last 10 years, are they efficient, effective, are they contributing to the objectives for which they are met, are they cost effective, and so on and so on. And the results were very shocking. In fact, we did it in phases. We started with the first phase of 13 agencies to develop the evaluation criteria and agree on the methodology and so on. And then we rolled it out. And the results were very shocking. And before even the final evaluation report came out, the president was informed that, you know what, there is a public sector evaluation which has been undertaken, and there is a lot of wastefulness in your government, there is a lot of duplication, there is a lot of power struggle, and so on, and the report is there. So the president called for the report before we launched it, we commissioned it. And a cabinet meeting was held, and a decision was taken to reform and restructure. As you heard from the video, these agencies have now been merged, and some of them scrapped, and others are being restructured. So I think that's really the best example I can give in terms of an evaluation really influencing public policy in the country.
Okay. So I want us to shift gear a little bit and talk about two key challenges that we've often encountered within the continent. And one is around funding, and the other is capacity. And many times within governments and within institutions, the programs are there because they are funded externally. Mm-hmm. So I want each of you to look at what's the level of government interest and investment in supporting and funding your evaluation systems that are being put in the country, and what are the capacity challenges in terms of implementing the evaluation. We start with you, Esmie, and then we go to Tim and Andrew.
To be honest with you, mostly the impact evaluations are sponsored by the development partners. The UNICEF provided the technical input in terms of design in collaboration with government. But in terms of who actually funds, the major part is the donor funding. Government monitors the field work. I remember the impact evaluation which was done by University of North Carolina, Asho leading the program. Government took that leading role in terms of practically following and monitoring, even to express the need to have the impact evaluation, because it was at that point where we wanted to scale up. In terms of findings, I think I've already shared, but I wanted to say that the findings, how government use them depends on a number of factors. Sometimes the political will takes a bigger chunk. And I'll give an example to one issue later on. And also cost effectiveness of the studies. Most of the studies demand huge resources, so you have to sit down. Is it a priority now, or should it be done later? Fortunately for Malawi, it was at the time when we needed it to scale up the program and to redesign. And also contextual, I think priorities are also key, where the studies are aligned to government demands. Local preferences sometimes also play a role. But I wanted to give an example of one finding which we found difficult to implement as an example of contextual local politics. the study that was done by Asho and the team, they noted that although we focused at the 10% of the population, the ultra poor, they wanted to fluctuate, to float the finding so that it depends on the level of poverty per district, instead of having 10% across the country due to other reasons. This was very difficult because of political, I think, appropriateness. Because what it means is that even in Parliament, MPs were a lot of to say, why more beneficiaries in your district than my district or constituencies? So that has been difficult. Let us know it that we have not implemented that. And even technically, to implement it was also difficult. But the problem of that is that you do target areas where the people are not really poor. They are moderate poor, while in another sample, if you had followed the recommendation, you do sample appropriately. I think that's another example I wanted to give on the negative side, that sometimes it's difficult to utilize the evidence the way it's recommended by the researchers because of contextual priorities. Thank you.
So, Tim, again, as you reflect on the questions, I want you to consider whether there's been a shift in terms of where the funding is coming from and government's commitment to that as well.
Okay.
Yeah, maybe before Tim comes, I wanted just to add that after the impact evaluation, we've seen a lot of interest by cabinet members to increase interest in social protection. And so to us, we really appreciate the impact because it has provided evidence that this is working. This is working. And when we do the overall assessment of all the programs, actually social cash transfer is receiving more attention. Okay. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So, in my case, the initial funding was provided by DFID, thanks to DFID, and the World Bank at that time. But once the National Evaluation Office was created and started doing influential evaluations in the country, we were able to convince the Ministry of Finance to allocate budgetary resources for evaluations. So we have seen our national budget allocate funding for evaluations incrementally over the last 10 years. And in fact, we now can afford every sector, education sector, agriculture sector, works, roads, except the infrastructure, energy and works is where we haven't been commissioning evaluations yet. But all the sectors now have a budget and it is increasing. So these evaluations feed into sector working groups. Every sector does a sector review annually. And the point is that within that sector review, there should be value for an evaluation. And so when the evaluations are presented, then we have a case. We have also done a study, in fact, across board to understand how much is actually budgeted for monitoring and evaluation, both for normal recurrent expenditure as well as for public development programs. And we found that the results vary between 1% to 3%. And 3% of a sector budget for monitoring and evaluation is a very significant amount of money. So in our case, actually the problem now is not that there's no budget. It's inadequate, but I think what is important is how much value are we getting from the resources that are budgeted for doing evaluations. On the capacity building part, I think we have gone a long way in terms of building capacity and having a pool of resource persons that can undertake evaluations. And this has been through a number of strategies. First, many African universities now have introduced development evaluation and courses on evaluation at undergraduate, postgraduate level. And I think this is also driven by the demand in the public. So many universities, at least in Uganda now, about 5 universities have graduate programs and postgraduate programs teaching evaluations. Secondly, we have worked through partners such as the Twendembele program. Twendembele is a regional capacity development program, a regional program amongst a number of African countries that are striving together to strengthen their national evaluation systems and practices and cultures. So through partnerships with programs like Twendembele, with partnership with 3IE, with CLEAR, Anglophone Africa, we have undertaken several training clinics, short-term courses, long-term courses, and so on impact on evaluations, on research, and so on. And we have been rolling out these over the years, not just in Uganda, but in several other countries. Adeline talked about AFREA. During the AFREA sessions, we ran, again, in partnership with these partners, several training programs where young evaluators and upcoming evaluators participate in these training programs and develop their skills. We also have been negotiating with IPDET, the program for development evaluation training, for some scholarships, and now CLEAR Anglophone Africa is doing it, and we're also sponsoring a number of students annually every winter to do more training. So the point I'm making is that there's a lot of capacity building efforts out there, and these are beginning to yield results. 5 years ago, for example, if you were looking for impact evaluation experts in the country, you wouldn't get. The adverts would be responded to by impact evaluation teams from elsewhere. But now, if you are looking for impact evaluation evaluators, you would probably attract some interest within the country. So we have gone a long way in developing capacity. There is still a huge gap, but I think we are getting there. Howard has talked about systematic reviews and evidence maps and so on. Now we have one research institution in Uganda which is working with Howard, and they're developing capacity to do systematic reviews and evidence maps and stuff like that. So I think we are in the right track. Thank you.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I mean, we face the same challenges. You know, our government inherited a huge fiscal deficit, and also we inherited an IMF program. So within that constraint, we needed to, be mindful of how we could insist that our partners, i.e. the sectors, align their programs with the national budget, which we did. But the key challenge is that the money was never released. Or if it was released, we will come maybe 4 months later. So that binding constraint is always there. But we've tried to go around that challenge by forming partnerships with other, organizations, external partners. We've worked with ID Insight. They sent 3 people on the ground and helping us, as I said earlier, with the free SHS program review. Recently, the government got funding from the World Bank as part of a broader public sector reform program. And within that, there's a component for the Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation. The program was approved about 3 weeks ago, and we hope that the funding will help us in carrying forward our activities in partnership with both external and internal collaborators. On the capacity, I think we have to make a distinction between having the formal education. I mean, in that sense, we have a lot of people, our focal persons are very well educated, but they don't have the evidence thinking or the evaluative thinking. So we've had to run short-term workshops to bring them into that mode of thinking about evidence, thinking about M&E. And we've run with the support of Clear Africa and Twende Mbele. We've run a few training workshops. The last one was done just last week by GIMPA, called the Hamatan School. So we're getting around it, but I think it's really the getting them to think evidence, to think M&E, and that is a work in progress. Yeah.
Thank you. So the last set of questions that we'll have for the panel, and then I will open up to the floor for comments and questions, is really to think about what role funders and technical agencies and partners could play. What is the one thing they are doing that you would rather they stop doing? And what is the one thing they are not doing that you really want them to do? And we can start with you, Andrew, and then we go to Esmie and Tim.
Yeah. Well, maybe because of my exposure and background, because I retired from the World Bank exactly 4 years ago, and I went home and I was asked to assist. And the minister always say that I'm doing my national service. I never did the national service, because I didn't do my university education in Ghana. Because if you do your university education in Ghana, you're required to do a national service. So I believe very strongly in partnerships, and we've been talking to Campbell, we've been talking to 3IE. We hope to get Emmanuel to Ghana, possibly in January. We're planning a big resource fair. We feel that at midterm, government should begin to demonstrate resource. So this is it's part of our work plan. We feel that it's important to build these relationships, and we'll continue to do that because government in Ghana or elsewhere in Africa never have enough resources, because the demand on government resources is huge. This free SHS, the government didn't work out the maths. It just went into it because it was straight from the manifesto. No concept paper, nothing. It just went into it, and then in midstream in implementation, you realize that there's challenges, but we are in it, and so our strategy is to really work with others.
So if you remove your World Bank hat and maybe talk about what you are hearing people in your group talking about, of what they would rather funders are not doing in the country, or what you would want them to...
No, I never said that I was wearing a World Bank hat.
Previous experience, and then you talk about what are the areas where they can be useful, and where are they actually undermining your efforts, if there is any?
Wow, undermining. Well, I think that I gave the example of ID Insight. Initially, when they came in, we were very skeptical, very young and enthusiastic. But then we realized that we don't have the capacity within the ministry, because our minister came from a policy background. He's an economist. He worked with a policy institute before he was invited to join government a few years ago. So he doesn't want to, with due respect to, public servants, he didn't see our ministry as a typical public service organization. And so he has not grown it, and therefore we don't have the internal capacity to do our work. So we believe that we can rely on organizations like 3IE Campbell and others, to assist us, and that's really the orientation. Maybe because I work with a bank, maybe that's influenced by it. But I think partnership is central in the work of evidence in our part of the world.
Okay. Esmie, in Malawi.
Thank you. I think one thing I would applaud our donor partners is that they respect government leadership in the decision making, and they would always wait to say, what does government say about this? And there is also a strong collaboration structures which combine government and the donor partners. So we do work together in this area of research to come up with the gaps or that need research, work together on the protocol, and where maybe we need them to minimize. I'm not sure about stopping, but maybe where the donor partners can stop is to where they work in silos. In the program that we have, if it's already fragmented, and if also on the donor side, each partner is also in silos, you can imagine what complications can come in, silos versus silos. And then the other issue is about the capacity building. I know that in most of the designs of the impact evaluations, the donor partners would prioritize external institutions. But I feel like maybe the previous speaker that I think the capacity has taken place, I feel, because my question is, for how long do you want to monitor if there is now capacity? I feel for Malawi that the researchers from external institutions, I think, have done their work. I'm also looking at a point when the external would wait for the locals to design so that they are following, they are monitoring, is it right or wrong, instead of using the local research institutions as maybe field work or just do minimal. Because in Malawi we do have a Center for Social Research. We do have the investors who are capable, not just capable, but they're actually doing research. They've done extensive research of the same design, randomized studies, deep qualitative, in other areas, early childhood development and other youth programs. But when it comes to social protection, because it's mostly donor supported, you see that the design is vice versa. So I'm looking forward to see how the skill transfer is sort of taken the monitoring approach to monitor and assess where the locals have got it right, I think. Thank you.
Thank you, Esmie. Tim?
I think it's very much the same. I don't want to repeat really. I think the donors should not operate through parallel systems. Really, we have established structures and systems which are strong enough to undertake an evaluation and to manage an evaluation. So commissioning an evaluation through an NGO or something like that, which is not part of the government evaluation facility, is undesirable and is unlikely to be used. Those are the evaluations whose results remain in the books and really remain inaccessible to the policymakers. So we have the systems, we have the structures, and every donor should work within those systems and support and strengthen those systems. So the don't is really not to undermine that, and the do is to work within the system. I think if that was done, then we would be better coordinated. We would see better uptake of evaluation findings. We are then better able to influence the use of evidence in the policy making, to challenge more policymakers to make use of the evidence that is available, and in fact to link that to the budgeting process, to the planning process, and so on. So actually very much the same with my two colleagues.
Thank you.
I would like to look at it in a broader context of resource delivery. Governance is about delivering, and increasingly governments are beginning to realize that. And if you use propaganda, you are making yourself vulnerable. One of the burning issues in Ghana is they build a highway, 2 highways, separate highways, and they haven't done footbridges to allow people to go over. And in one of the highways, since January, almost 200 people have been knocked down. The last one happened just last week. And people are saying, you build roads and only 20% of the population drive. And now, you know, the poor, the pedestrians are not being taken care of. So these are some of the issues. You can use propaganda to some extent, but eventually evidence will get you out of trouble. So if you did a study and you came out with findings that show that people are being killed on that road, you have to react. You have to solve the problem. So shelving it or pretending that it doesn't exist will not help you. So obviously, and then the other related issue of risk of monitoring and evaluation departments or agencies or ministries disappearing. I think, again, for a thinking government, and increasingly government have to think. You need evidence to protect you, to be able to demonstrate that indeed you are delivering. So if you have a thinking government, then they will see the need to maintain a Ministry of Monitoring and Evaluation rather than killing it. So I think that some government may do away with it, but the need for evidence will always be there. So that is it. Research, design, randomized control trials. Well, our ministry is relatively new, but as I indicated earlier, we partnered with, and we intend to partner with agencies within and outside to help us do more systematic reviews. And already we've started with ID Insight. So, of course, the randomized control trial may not be the ideal method for now, but we believe in rigorous use of rigorous methods, preferably mixed methods. Yeah, so I think, and depending on who has the ministry or the agency, if you have like our minister who is a trained economist, he will not, do a quick and dirty job. He would like to do something because you have some of his colleagues in cabinet are very smart, and if you take shoddy information to them, they will maul you, So, so I think gradually, but it's a work in progress. We're moving into a culture where evidence will become central in decision making.
Thank you. Esmie?
Yeah, thank you. I want to tackle 2 issues about the NGOs doing research. Fortunately, under my ministry, you have the role of coordinating and regulating policies, civil society organizations in Malawi. For me, I would say the NGOs in the country, in the African context, I think should leave the research to research institutions. Because the whole reason why the NGOs or civil society are there is to complement government efforts in implementation. of programs. So I feel that they should leave the research part to others, not to be doing research and implement. For me personally, I would feel that this is a conflict of interest somehow. I think I've also commented earlier on about African countries be able to do these studies. Maybe I would doubt the systematic reviews, which are mostly, I think, electronic and the like, but the randomized control studies, I think they have learned, they have mastered the art. Thank you.
Thank you. Tim.
Okay, yeah, very quickly. So on the first one, is uncomfortable good, the issue of independence of the evaluation. I think it is good, and I think in our case, we made it strict in the national evaluation policy that evaluations have to be independent, because we are aware that governments are defensive. There is no president or prime minister who is going to allow his programs to be shut down by your evaluation if it is being done by the government team. So the principle of independence of evaluations is very much emphasized. And in fact, for our evaluation reports and findings, we are quite insistent that those principles are applied. So in our case, uncomfortable is good in that case. And I think that's a good thing for us, because then government really becomes open to criticism. If the programs are not delivering, they're not working, then that's government should accept the weaknesses and transform. On the second issue of the diversity of civil society voice, I hope I didn't misrepresent or miscommunicate here. I think the importance of the civil society in terms of providing positive criticism is very important, is very useful. And in fact, NGOs and the civil society are probably a very, very big source of evidence, even in our case, in terms of the functioning of public policies and public programs and so on. So we really encourage and welcome the voice and the evaluations, the evidence that is generated by the civil society. However, the fact is that if you are to really effectively influence policy, then you need to either relate with or generate this evidence from the national systems. And I will give an example from what was presented early in the morning. In the morning, I think Mani said that there was a good evaluation of a program on gender violence or something like that in Uganda and so on, and the results are not being used. Now, if that evaluation was undertaken by the Ministry of Gender, commissioned by the Ministry of Gender, and the evidence was brought to the head of the Ministry of Gender, the probability that those findings would be used would be as high as probably 60, 70, 80%. If that same evidence is generated by an NGO working in the gender sector, let's say a civil society organization working in the gender sector, and the evidence is brought by that NGO, the probability that the sector will adopt it is very low. It's close to zero. So the way public policy works there is that if the evidence is not associated with the sectoral structures, the probability that it will be uptaken is very low. And that's the point I was saying. So that does not mean that the voice is not important. I think that contribution is still very important in terms of influencing the uptake of the evidence. However, they should be related. And then finally, on on the question of monitoring and evaluation, I think what I would just like to say here is that in our own systems, I think the monitoring systems are very well developed, far much well developed. They are quite robust. They generate regularly very good reports in terms of how the routine public sector activities are functioning, who is delivering on target, who is delivering on time, as by quality, and so on. And so the use of the information from the monitoring reports is much more well developed. However, the evaluation side is still weak. And for example, if you go to lower local governments, at the central government, a ministry has the resources, the capacity to commission and manage an evaluation and actually take the results forward. But a local government does not have, for example, the officers to commission an evaluation. So the evaluation side is still much less developed, and actually the linkage is not strong enough for a systematic use of monitoring information to feed into, for example, planning or designing an evaluation. So that's an area where we need to do better. Thank you.
Thank you. Just a few quick thoughts. I think one of the things that's really evident this morning is countries in Africa are at different points in terms of their national systems for evaluation. And when you look at a continent with, even if you think about sub-Saharan Africa, I think 46 countries, 54 on the continent, they're all very different. I mean, population Nigeria, 200 million plus or minus, Seychelles, under 100,000, budgets, GDP, you can look at South Sudan, under 300, Equatorial Guinea, over 20,000. So it's a complex country, and then we have these differences. But it's also very evident that the capacity and the interest of government is growing, because within regions, we also compete with each other, we learn from each other, we want to see the good practices in Uganda and want to adopt it in Kenya. We want to see what's going on in our brother in Ghana and take it over in Nigeria when it works. And so it is really important that we recognize the good practices that are going on, the interest that is there, and how do we build on that and strengthen and support that. But I think it's also coming clear that there is need to work with local institutions and structures where they exist. I don't know how many times you've heard Wedden Bella mentioned here, WASI in West Africa, AFRIA, institutions that have committed to building capacity for evidence generation and use within the continent. And they can do a whole lot in supporting efforts to change that landscape. And I really want to say, I think the work I'm doing now is really looking at how do you build sustainable and strong institutions in Africa. If you wanted to make £100 million or dollars investment today in sub-Saharan Africa, and you want to put it in an African institution, my guess is it might take you the next 3 years to actually find the organization you would trust with $100 million. But if that is the reality today, should that be the reality in 3, 4, 5, 10 years? And if we cannot make the $10 million investment today, we cannot make the $50 million in 10 years. And I think institutions are asking to be trusted more. And the more we do that, then groups like the experiences we have in Uganda could be amplified to affect many more countries and in the region. So it's really critical that we find ways to engage. Esmie did talk about working with local research institutions in Malawi, that they've been doing a lot of work. And I think recognizing that is quite critical. The partnership that Andrew talked about, yeah, it is important that we build on these structures. Finally, I think this session's been, maybe I will end with Andrew's point, which I agree very much with, that I led a research institution in Africa. You can do a lot of excellent research, get it published in the Lancet, in Science, in Nature, and everything. But at the end of the day, it doesn't change anything on the ground. You can go out for a coffee in the evening with a minister, and you share just a percentage of what has happened. And the next day, you can actually have a debate in Parliament around a change in this particular policy. The role that local institutions and working through established structures and systems could do in amplifying and holding governments accountable. I think once you are on the ground, you have incentives for the outcomes that needs to happen within countries. And I think there's a lot they can do outside of the established formal structures and systems that we rely on with our dissemination programs to engage with government for better and more effective use of evidence. At the end of the day, that's really what this is all about. It's about changing lives, achieving impact in our development outcomes. And one way to do that is to ensure that we have the institutions that can do this, can promote it, but can, in the long haul, be able to sustain the engagement with governments. I think that's been my summary. I think it's been great to have the audience participate on the questions and all of those. And join me, please, in appreciating and thanking our panelists for their insight.